Awesome. I'm just giving you guys your 2-minute warning. We're going to get started in 2 minutes. And I'd like to ask if Jim Aldridge and Daniel Watson could make their way to the front table so that they're ready for their panel. Good morning. How are you? 9:40. You guys, I know. Just so you're ready.
I haven't written it yet.
Oh, shit. I've got extra. Hey. You must be. Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay,
Great,
come on.
thank you.
Daniel.
See, yeah, exactly.
Good to
Great
see
to
you.
see you. Geez, you're pretty big. This many people like you.
And just so you guys know, Marielle is taking, she'll be the timekeeper and she'll give you 3 minutes. And then you go. You guys can see. Are you using the tablet? Never mind. Put that in there. So good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 2 of Making Modern Treaties Work. That's what we're all here for, right? Yes. My name is Medea Alatini, and I am your MC for today. And we have our panelists. Our first panelists are ready to go. They're on the ball. Today we have another full agenda. You would have noticed from the slides that the proceedings, the note takers, and the PowerPoints are on the LCAC website. They're being loaded there as PDFs. I'm just going to do a quick run through of today's agenda, remind you of the silent auction. I think the silent auction has been moved out into the hallway, so please take a look. All the vendors, there's even a nice scarf like this that you can get. All the vendors have donated something, and all of the proceeds from the sales will go to Silitinique Youth Engagement Program. The rundown on today's schedule, we have our first plenary, whole of government, question mark, challenges and opportunities. And then we have another plenary after that for a better tomorrow, a coffee and networking break where we are having a special youth caucus opportunity on the side. It's still unclear whether that youth caucus is going to be here or in the hall at the end. Then we have our breakout sessions. So we, again, have 5 breakouts. The implementation tools, intergovernmental relations, building community and economic capacity, structures in government, and legal panels. Then we have lunch. The youth will also have reserved tables so they can caucus at lunch. There is another 5 breakouts after lunch. Sustaining Indigenous languages, revenues, financial relationships in modern treaty, food security, the 2015 Cabinet Directive, reflections after 5 years. Breakout 4 or 5 is the UNDRIP and national implications for modern treaty implementation. The afternoon coffee will also have a youth networking break. Then the plenary 5 is where next? Priorities and opportunities. Then plenary 6 is language and culture, the foundation for the future. There's closing remarks by the LCAC co-chairs, and we should be wrapped up by 5 today. So I'm going to introduce our first plenary of the day, Whole of Government, Challenges and Opportunities. Jim Aldridge is a partner at Aldridge and Rosling, LLP. And Daniel Watson is the Deputy Minister, Indigenous Crown Relations and Northern Affairs. And they are going to be speaking about the whole of government and challenges and opportunities. So I'll let you guys take it away.
Thank you very much, Mattia. Good morning, everyone. And congratulations, those of you who've turned out at such an early hour. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to be here. So thank you for showing up. The name of the session, Whole of Government, I was thinking of as I was driving in this morning, listening on the news to the report. Some of you may have heard, some of you haven't, but on CBC this morning, the main story was about infestations and bad drinking water at Terrasse de Chaudière, 10 Wellington, where so many of our friends work. And they talked about now they can't drink the water. It seems there's bats in the walls, live bats, old bats, dead bats, live bats, cockroaches, bed bugs. And I got a whole new understanding of what whole of government means. It's 10 Wellington. Because I used to think it's where your letters went when you write to the government and you don't get an answer. What happened to your letter? It went to the whole of government. But of course, it's spelled with a W, and it's an initiative that has been underway for a while, and I'll come back to that. But I wanted to back up the time dial a little bit further and remind everyone, many of you know this very, very well, that it was 17 years ago that the Land Claims Agreements Coalition was established in 2003. And that was the result of a coming together in the nation's capital of all of the modern treaty signatories at the time in 2003. And it was the first time, people had known each other and interacted with each other, of course, for many years, but it was the first time that all of the modern treaty signatories got together at one place. From one end of the country to the other, from Niskat in the Nass Valley to Nunavut, Yukon and Northwest Territories to Quebec. And they brought together the multifaceted experience and perspectives of different peoples, different geographies, different cultures, different histories, different traditions. But all of the groups had 2 overriding things in common. The first is that each and every one of them had gone through the crucible of negotiating comprehensive land claims agreements, now known as modern treaties. And in most cases, those negotiations took place over the course of many years, indeed decades, struggling with every issue because, of course, modern treaties were comprehensive land claims agreements. And the Indigenous parties were told that it was necessary to address either all possible issues, or at least all possible issues dealing with lands and resources, in order to be truly comprehensive. So it was necessary, as those of us who went through that will recall, to address issues that weren't immediate, but if they were going to be addressed ever, they had to be addressed in the modern treaty. So detailed rules were put together. And with the knowledge, support, and participation of their various populations, these Indigenous nations, peoples, and governments made the courageous compromises at the table necessary to secure, as the Niska put it, a just and honorable settlement of the land question. All of them sat and, as I say, over the course of years and decades, negotiated their place in Canada. All of them sought to achieve certainty. It was very funny. It used to always be at the table that governments would say, we're giving you all of these benefits, giving you all these benefits, and all we want in return is certainty. Now, wait a minute. No. As the Indigenous side would say, certainty, certainly. Whenever there's uncertainty, it always works against the Indigenous people. Certainty is of way more protective value to the Indigenous side. Uncertainty works very well to the interests of the Crown and parties in Canada who aren't necessarily on the same side. So certainty needed to be achieved, and it was achieved by taking rights that the Indigenous peoples had been asserting for centuries and turning them into established rights, agreed to rights, existing rights within the meaning of Section 35, through a process, as I say, of discussion, pragmatism, honorable compromise, and a setting out of the relationship in detail. So that's number one that all these groups had in common. And the second, way back in 2003, was that all of them were encountering problems with getting the federal government to comply with the promises that had been made. All of them faced the challenges of a treaty partner who back in 2003 would address implementation and fulfilling the treaty with the point of view of all we have to do is check off our obligations. Every time we fulfill an obligation, check. And federal officials and politicians at the time said, we believe that the objectives of land claims agreements are achieved if the obligations are fulfilled. One of the points of view that the coalition that emerged from this meeting brought to bear, and it was very much supported by the Auditor General at the time, in 2004, was that implementing modern treaties requires a focus not just on fulfilling obligations, which is of course important, but also on achieving the parties' objectives. And there needs to be a measuring stick for achieving objectives. Obligations are a means to an end, they are not an end to itself. And so the coalition formed with a program, a policy, a mandate that really extended just to one thing, bringing about, working towards achieving a better federal policy in respect of the implementation of modern treaties. So that's why the coalition is not an organization, I often say. It's a coalition of independent peoples and governments who all have a single shared objective. Everybody has many other similar objectives, but the coalition exists in respect of making sure that treaties are implemented and respected. And following 2003, as they say, history took place. I won't go through it all. Highlights and lowlights include rapid progress with the Martin government that came crashing to an end in 2005. Then virtually no progress for quite a long time. Participation in legislative initiatives, including appearing before the Senate Committee on Constitutional Affairs, 2007, which resulted in that committee unanimously recommending that the Interpretation Act be amended so as to include a non-derogation clause that would set out the commitment of government that all legislation should be interpreted in such a way as to uphold Section 35 rights and not to abrogate or derogate from them. That recommendation has still not been adopted. 2008, Senate Committee on Aboriginal Peoples issued a very important report, remains important, honoring the loopholes. But its recommendations fell on deaf ears. Really, the next and most significant event took place in the summer of 2015. In the late, it seems a long time ago already, in the late Harper era. And to his credit, his considerable credit, and the credit of people within the department, but the Honourable Bernard Valcourt worked with his cabinet colleagues and brought about, in July of 2015, some very important measures that we talked about at the conference in 2016. The first was a statement of principles on the implementation of modern treaties that was co-developed between members of the coalition and officials at CERNA, as it now is, ANSI, INAC, CERNA. Co-developed, excellent cooperative work, excellent set of principles. Highly recommend them to everybody. It seems really hard to get the current government to remember that they're there, but I'll come back to that. And then the second part associated with the Statement of Principles was a cabinet directive on the implementation of modern treaties. Again, it wasn't perfect. It didn't fulfill all of the objectives that the coalition had set out and has been working towards since 2003, but it did include some very important innovations, and credit should be given. Included the establishment of the Deputy Minister's Oversight Committee, where all affected departments of Canada, the deputies meet on a regular basis, chaired by the deputy, now Daniel, of CERNA. It includes the establishment of a structure called the Modern Treaty Implementation Office, which was intended to be the secretariat, as we were told, for the Deputy Minister's Oversight Committee, first and foremost, but there are issues with its structure and how it ended up being located, but it was still nonetheless an important innovation. There is the direction that there would be something called the Assessment of Modern Treaty Implications, in which each and every bit of federal legislation or policy would have to be reviewed with a view to assessing how it would affect modern treaty rights before it would proceed to cabinet for decision. I can come back to that later if necessary, but thus far, it has not been a success. I don't like to say abject failure, because that sounds really strong. So how about we say an abject lack of success? But it's still a work in progress, and hopefully it will get better. There's also measures, requirements for evaluation of performance, which is still a work in progress as well. So this was described as, and intended to be, a whole-of-government approach, in which implementation would not simply be the responsibility of CERNA. It would be the responsibility, recognizing that treaties are with the Crown, it would be responsibility of all departments, the entire Crown, and not just something where one mid-level department is out there hoping for the best for the Crown's partners in these treaties. The other thing I want to say is that there is no doubt but before, but certainly since 2015, the officials occupying the key roles in CERNA dedicated towards supporting modern treaties are first-rate people, first-rate, committed, intelligent, hardworking individuals, from the deputy level, Daniel and his predecessor, through the senior assistant deputy minister level, the assistant deputy minister, director general, head of MTIO. Don't have a word of criticism for any of them. We have our differences, but not a bad word for any of their efforts to make the whole of government approach work. But it hasn't. And that's really the theme of what I wanted to talk about today. Is this is very peculiar. It's a question that I pose to the room. because I don't have the answer. How is it that we get an excellent statement of principles, a really good cabinet directive, top-rate people in all of the key positions, an understanding at the institutional level, at least, that we've never had before about the necessity for implementation to be based on a whole-of-government approach. And yet, 5 years later, there are more disputes between modern treaty holders and the Crown than there have been before. Both co-chairs are engaged in dispute resolution now. I'm told, anecdotally, by friends in other modern treaty groups, there's more disputes on the horizon. The relationship with government as a whole, not the individuals that I referred to, is worse, from my perception, than it's ever been. How does that happen? That's really quite peculiar. One would not have thought back in 2015, 2016, particularly with the election of a government that professes that no relationship is more important, et cetera, that the situation would deteriorate in the way that it seems to have. So how explain it? Everyone will have their own theories and their own perceptions, and as I say, I don't pretend to have any special insight. But nonetheless, I'll offer a few possibilities. I was going to say the new government, but it's not so new anymore. The Trudeau government, since 2016, has taken a number of initiatives that have primarily focused on what's variously referred to as recognition, and now as being described as under the rubric of compliance and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP. It's a terrible acronym, isn't UNDRIP a terrible acronym? I'm sorry, it sounds like I've got this leak in my kitchen sink and I call a plumbing company that's called UNDRIP, and they'll come and never mind. I find UNDRIP a very unfortunate acronym, but there you go. Think there is no doubt but that the government, from the highest level, is genuinely motivated by a broad, if perhaps and with respect uninformed, desire to do generally the right thing in respect of Aboriginal peoples. But again, looking at this approach, I'll say a few words about it now, but I say respectfully, it appears, at least to me and to some others that I've spoken to, that the approach has been embraced and communicated throughout the whole of government, but that the approach has been to date lacking in rigor at best, and perhaps even lacking in content. What does it mean? When it first started back in 2016, and there was a new statement of principles, so we had the 2015 Statement of Principles in respect of implementation of modern treaties, but in the spring of 2016, they seemed to be supplanted by another Statement of Principles about dealings with Indigenous peoples generally, which weren't co-developed, as far as I know. Maybe they were. And it's been very difficult to get attention to the Statement of Principles that were done for modern treaties ever since then. But what's been focused on instead was a project that was first described as enacting recognition legislation. And I say again, with respect, many of us in the trenches struggled with the concept. What recognition legislation, what is that? As far as we could tell when it was described and trying to read between the lines of the various statements and professions of good and earnest, and I'm sure genuine good faith, about what it would be, is it seemed to be legislation that would recognize rights, Section 35 rights. But Section 35 says Aboriginal and treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. So we're going to have legislative recognition of rights that are already constitutionally recognized. And I'm sorry, I'm a simple guy, I find that confusing. Pose the question like this: does giving constitutionally recognized rights legislative recognition mean that those rights are now more recognized or less recognized? What does it even mean? to say we're going to pass legislation that will recognize constitutionally recognized rights? Well, with that mix of optimism and cynicism that keeps those of us going in this trade for many years, we were told, no, 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 no. The idea is rather that Indigenous peoples' rights, in Section 35, should now be recognized with no need for proof or agreement. Because before, Aboriginal treaty, but really Aboriginal rights, in order to enforce them, you had to show that you had them, and what they were, and where they applied, and who had them. I'm not going to make you do that anymore. You don't have to prove or get agreement to your rights. We'll recognize them. Well, how exactly will that work? And let me just say that that is now segued, before I get to talking about in practice, that's segued now into the UNDRIP discussion. It's very much the same thing. So, let's go back a few years. So we're going to have a new approach to recognition, to these rights which people are asserting. Certainly it's not particularly relevant to modern treaty groups. Go back to the beginning of the talk. We spent decades defining and outlining and agreeing and compromising and give and take and setting out in a treaty modern treaty people's rights. So it's not about that. It's about other kinds of rights. What are they? Well, it could be three approaches. One of three approaches. The legislation or the approach by the Crown could be to say to people, all right, under the heading of recognition, you have whatever you say you have. If you say you've got a right, you've got it, and we'll enforce it accordingly. That doesn't seem really workable. To say nothing about problems with definition and location, what happens when a right that an Indigenous people asserts that it has is inconsistent with other people's rights, whether they be non-Aboriginal people's rights or, the concern that we have in this room, what happens when they're inconsistent with established rights? How do you recognize both? It seems as though it cannot be a blank check. You have whatever you say you have. But maybe people's expectations were raised, thinking that's exactly what it would be. I'll let others judge that. Another possibility would be to say to Indigenous people, okay, we recognize whatever you say you have as long as it's on this list or within these bounds or these parameters. That seems tricky too. Trying to get agreement on what those bounds or that list or the parameters would be without going back to just negotiating it. It's hard to understand how that would work. Or the third possibility, which the cynical side of me thought in the day, is that it would be nothing other than a somewhat fluffy, squishy expression of goodwill that would make everybody feel good about the relationship, but not turn into anything on the ground until such time as there'd been either proof or agreement. Maybe that's what it's become. I don't know. A more useful concept, I think, has been the approach that others have described that's being undertaken with peoples now, the incremental approach to treaty making. Instead of saying you have to agree to everything at the same time, the way that all of the modern treaty groups were up until now, to take it, let's take it subject matter at a time. Let you define your priority. Let's work out practical underground arrangements for dealing with this particular topic, which might vary across the country. That seems like a good idea. That seems sensible. But again, not at the expense of fulfilling the obligations that were already made to the groups that had to negotiate everything because that was the government policy. Cannot be moved to the back of the bus because there's a new fashion in town. In any event, the result seems to have been over the course of the last 4 years that modern treaties are often outside of the group, the part of the department I talked about, outside of that group, in the other departments, modern treaty rights are forgotten or devalued. letters are written by other departments that say quite remarkable things. They equate treaty rights, excuse me, that have been so painfully and carefully agreed upon and clearly set forth through the process of compromise and give and take, they equate them, in letters we've received from other departments, with, the letter goes like this. While we, of course, recognize and respect your treaty rights, at the same time, we must also respect the Statement of Principles from February 2016 and the recognition set out in the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, so we will balance your rights with these asserted rights. Please come to a meeting, we'll play honest broker, and you guys figure out how to do that. Okay. And that's endemic. That approach to giving equal value to rights that aren't in treaties, that are merely asserted, underlies many of the disputes that are currently underway between certainly the Nisga'a Nation and the Crown, and perhaps others as well. The difficulty is not with the concept that Indigenous people should be respected in the assertions of the rights that they've been making. Of course they should be respected. And the courts have set out in some detail the legal bounds for that recognition, the duty to consult and accommodate if there's going to be Crown action which might adversely affect those rights. It sets out a structure for respect and trying to protect those rights until such time as they've become established, to use the words of the Supreme Court of Canada. But they're more fashionable. And in case anyone thinks that I'm overstating the problem, we were quite concerned to read the mandate letter that recently went out, the new mandate letter to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, which doesn't mention modern treaties, doesn't show up. Why is that? There is a reference, I should say, in fairness, to treaties generally. The mandate letter says that the minister is to co-develop, there's that word, with Indigenous peoples a new distinctions-based process for the ongoing review, maintenance, and enforcement of Canada's treaty obligations between the Crown and Indigenous communities, not nations, I notice, or peoples, but communities, but whatever. A new distinctions-based process for treaty obligations. Well, to the extent modern treaties are supposed to be in there, it highlights another problem. Distinctions-based approach means that coalition members who are Inuit and coalition members who are First Nations are going to be treated distinctly, rather than recognizing and respecting the coalition that they've put together. My time's up, but I wanted to end with a solution before Daniel stands up and tells me he's wrong. Daniel and others have said, and heard in the past, it's a standard thing to say, and I'm sorry my time's up, Daniel, but you'll have time, is often say, well, we can't tell the other departments what to do. No deputy can tell another deputy what to do. No department can tell another department what to do. But the solution that I'm going to offer, and Daniel, you can write your thank you note to me later, is in the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Act that was enacted, I believe, late last spring. In Section 7, it sets out the minister's responsibilities. And it says, this is new, it says the minister is responsible for A, exercising leadership within the Government of Canada in relation to the affirmation and implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples, recognized and affirmed by Section 35, and the implementation of treaties and other agreements with Indigenous peoples. The Parliament gave the minister the authority to take leadership on the implementation of modern treaties. And I say with respect that that is all the authority that CERNA needs to indeed tell the other departments that modern treaty obligations must be fulfilled, not watered down, not balanced, not breached, not abridged, in favor of some other program that the government is undertaking, but that the minister and the department can indeed and I say respectfully, ought to, tell the other departments to remember the Crown's obligation to modern treaty nations. Good point, but I'm out of time.
I might hire Jim as my lawyer one day. I don't know. So. Bonjour tout le monde. Un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous. A real pleasure to be with you today and to speak to this group in particular. I want to start off by recognizing who's represented here today. The groups that are here today took a leap that was often a very difficult leap to take, having watched a few of them go past. And when you took those leaps, those things were an even greater risk at that point in time, an even greater unknown than they are today. When you have a conversation, when I have a conversation with people about what I do for work, for the first time, probably in the last 5 years or so, when I talk about working in treaty negotiations and things like that, people actually know what I'm talking about. In earlier parts of my career, when I would talk to people about it, it was this weird, crazy thing that most of them thought was a really bad idea. And when we were negotiating these agreements in the 1990s, some of you in the 1980s, and maybe a few of you in here in the 1970s, these things were far from known quantities. And they were extraordinarily difficult, not only in the first instance for governments to negotiate with Inuit and with First Nations at the time. I got to see from the sidelines how hard it was to convince First Nations people and Inuit people that these were worthy objectives. And I know that many people in leadership and who were negotiating and supporting those negotiations paid an enormous price to get to that point. None of these agreements were unanimous. For those of you who followed the results, often there was significant voices that doubted greatly whether or not it was the path to take forward. And I take very seriously the responsibility of proving to people as the decades go forward that it was actually the right choice. Because the voices in First Nations and in Inuit communities that said that this isn't enough, that this is too risky, that this is not exactly where we wanted to go, and we haven't been able to convince governments of where we should go, are all legitimate voices that we need to demonstrate collectively in the agreement that we share had worthy answers in that. And the way we demonstrate the worthiness of those answers is what we do with the agreement. And so I want to recognize all those of you here who took that step, recognize the understanding that we have, how difficult that step was within the own communities that you represent. We know you think that we were difficult, but we also want you to understand that we know that it was a very difficult ride in many instances inside your own communities. And that responsibility as a federal public servant, and I would be saying the same thing if I were still a provincial public servant, that responsibility that we have to make good on the difficulty of that journey is something that is critically important. I want to talk a bit about the history of implementation. And it's not just because I'm a history graduate and I like history, but I think it provides context. Context not as an excuse for things that haven't gone right, or not context to simply prove that everything that happened was right, because that's clearly not the case. But history as context because I think it shows some of the places where we have been at our worst and some of the places where we have been our best and where it is that we will want to go into the future. And it might surprise you, I even surprised Jim, there are a number of things that he said that I actually don't quarrel with. So if you go back to the 1970s, when the Government of Canada was doing its very first land claim agreements, this was a line of business that nobody understood. I got to have dinner in Nunavut the other week with John Amagolik, a guy they call the father of Nunavut, who arrived here in Ottawa as a 23-year-old in 1971. I have a pretty good understanding of what the federal government does with people that it just doesn't understand, who are asking things that it's never going to do. And I don't know how a 23-year-old, accompanied by a bunch of other 25 and 30 years olds, managed to take on the federal government in the early 1970s. He told me that what they said to him was, well, we'll give you a couple of caribou and fish and get you back to the airport because you're wasting your time. And he stuck with it until we got an agreement in Nunavut in the early 1990s. But in those early days, this was a brand new business line for the Government of Canada. And not only did we not know how to negotiate them at the beginning, we had no particular thought of how we would deliver on them. And that's true of many of the original agreements. And that led to some pretty significant disputes. Some of you in this room will remember Michel Leroy, who was a senior assistant deputy minister responsible for treaties and governance. One of the results of those disputes and what we didn't do is that we all bade him farewell one day and thought we'd never see him again because he had a $1.3 billion check in his pocket. And he literally had that check in his pocket, and he was flying to northern Quebec, and he was going to pay it as damages to the Cree in respect of not having delivered on that agreement. We learned some hard lessons there. We learned some hard lessons on the Nunavut agreement as well, where there were cases that said or argued matters put forward saying that we hadn't lived up to our obligations there. And again, some hard lessons learned. But in those early stages, we hadn't really thought about implementation. And as a result, learned hard lessons. One of the ways we responded to those lessons was to say to ourselves, well, let's not let that happen again. And that, to me, is the second phase of implementation that we've tried over the years. And that's where we would do these very detailed implementation plans. And we would get down to the nth degree when we would look at commas, and we would look at numbers, and we would have debates about what should be done. And we would make these lists of these things. But more or less exactly as Jim described, you'd tick off those boxes and then you'd be done. And once you'd done those things, almost all transactions, you'd be completed the world of implementation. But the problem with that is that treaties don't just set out a shopping list of things to do. What treaties do more than anything else, in my view, is they unbalance the unbalance and imbalance of power that existed previously. Jim talked about the fact that uncertainty has always worked against Indigenous peoples. He's talked about uncertainty continuing to work against Indigenous governments, treaty governments. And one of the things that treaties were actually designed to do was rebalance the power dynamic in that relationship. We were no longer entitled to ask the question when we started a conversation on fisheries, a conversation on environmental assessment, a conversation on child and family services, who are you? That was the starting point in so many of the conversations that we would have up until that point. Treaties, as much as anything else in my view, answered that question. We're the government that we all agree exists, that is the government that is entitled to speak on these issues. That fundamentally resets a power dynamic when there can be no debate anymore to that central question, who are you? You can't have an implementation activity sheet for who are you. That has to come from an understanding, a deep understanding of what the power dynamic and relationship is supposed to be. It comes from remembering that in all of the things that you do, not just when a particular activity takes place. So, where have we been at our worst, arguably? I think we've been at our worst when we haven't known the facts. And there's a bunch of reasons that we sometimes don't know the facts. But often people have pointed out in black and white to us that this is what we agreed to, and it's different from what we're doing. And sometimes, some folks in this room, I won't point to anybody in particular, have been surprised at what people didn't know. And without telling any tales of school, I suspect in some boardrooms and some places with bats and bees and other things in them, there have been some people who have been surprised at what we didn't know. For those of you who are federal public servants in this room, one of the first things that I would say to you is know each agreement. One of the things we're very good at as a system is standardizing things. It's actually the secret to success for any large institution, but can also be at the core of its failure. It needs to be the case that every single person in this room who fills out a passport application the same way, with the same information, should get the same answer. It needs to be the case that everybody who puts the same information into their income tax forms and calculates what they're owed should get the same answers. We can't have a system that says, well, I tell you what, I'll give you twice as much as the previous person. Or actually, I won't give you a passport even though you gave me the same information as everybody else. So yes, we need that standardization. But just as with free trade agreements that we have with countries around the world, you can't apply the rules from the Panama trade deal to NAFTA, or USMCA as we now call it. You can't do that for all the other trade. You have to understand the individual agreement. And it's important that you know those things, and it's important that you as a federal public servant prepare your successor for that. We cannot manage a relationship into the long term that depends on the presence of a particular individual. I thank Jim for his comments about the dedication that he sees in federal public servants working on implementation, and I certainly echo that. But one of the things I will say to you, federal public servants here, is one of the best things that you will ever do in the world of implementation is you will not only understand each and every deal that you have a responsibility for from top to bottom, you'll make sure that if you win the 649 tomorrow and disappear, that Canada's relationship with that First Nation will not suffer because of that. That's another place where the uncertainty has done harm over the years to many Indigenous governments. There's also a place where we have been accused of assuming that we know the facts. And I think in some ways that's more dangerous than not knowing the facts. Most of us are pretty good as public servants, if we don't know, of not pretending to know, just because it always ends up badly. But when we think we know but we don't, we have sometimes got into places that have been more problematic than if we just admitted up front that we didn't know. It comes back to the central point of know the deal, know the specifics of it, but also check into the things that may turn out to be mythologies. Another place where we have been accused of behaviors that have caused challenges sometimes, and it's not unique to the federal public service, it's not unique to provincial public services, and it's not unique to Indigenous governments, but where we've sought to revise what was really meant in a treaty. And there have been those instances. And I think it's actually very important to have the conversations internally with all of our various partners. What exactly did we really mean here? And some of those things might be uncomfortable. And I'll come back in a minute to what it means when what we agreed to is different from what we're doing as a default position today. Another point that I'll return to is where we have focused too much on the purely transactional and lost sight of the bigger picture. That is another area that we have had great issues in. And it's an area that Jim and I and others have talked about when we have the questions about what is the best way going forward to make sure that we all understand what's being done and what's not being done. I'm concerned that if we have an approach that ends up focusing solely on the transactional, that we will miss the most important parts of what treaties were intended to do in the first place, which is to reset the power dynamic between us and to the advantage of Indigenous governments. And the final area that I would say we have had the most challenges with is when we haven't been able to figure out who is on our side. That is always an issue. If you cannot figure out who is responsible, the likelihood of it getting done drops exponentially. And so I'll come now to the questions of what's our best path forward, in my view. I'll start with where I started before. Know your agreements. If you don't know the agreements, if you don't know the specifics of the agreements, if you don't know the players that you're going to deal with, then it's going to be problematic. Canada has ongoing disputes with the United States about softwood lumber, has ongoing disputes with the rest of the world on supply management, and you can rest assured that the people who are there to ensure Canada's interests are protected know exactly who the people are in each of those governments that they need to deal with on that issue. And they probably got a line as to who their successor is, and they're building those relationships today. My view is we should be doing the same thing when it comes to Indigenous governments. If there are going to be development projects in an area coming up, even though they're not there today, understand exactly what the environmental assessment provisions say. If you know there's going to be an issue where there is going to be conflict, as Jim talked about, with other First Nations who are going to have interest, know who those First Nations are, know who the players are, know what rights they're claiming, know what the difference is between the written agreements or the claimed rights that are there. Have a plan for dealing with those things. Be clear on what it is that we agreed to in the past that is different from our default position today. This, to me, is where one of the greatest challenges comes for any institution. You agree on something at a particular point in time. You bind yourself to that thing at that point in time. And then life goes on 20, 30, 40 years. And we develop new and different ways of doing things as a default position. But the fact that our world changes, the fact that we do things differently, does not stop the black and white of what we agreed to, which has the highest constitutional protection that you can get in Section 35. And so our subsequent program decisions, our subsequent preferences over time are not things that get to undo that. I would say that if you are responsible on the federal public service side of things for implementation somewhere of some part in the agreement, you should know where is it that what we agreed to is different from our default approach to that topic today anywhere else in the country. Because I can pretty much guarantee you that that will be the source of some of the biggest challenges that you'll face. And if they're there and they're staring at you in the face, you should know what they are. Second thing, and it's similar, is if you're a federal public servant and you're responsible for negotiating, or rather implementing an agreement, know where your who questions are. Because again, you're going to spend a disproportionate amount of effort resolving those. So where it's not clear who is going to do what, where it's not clear who's got the lead, identify those issues up front. If you do that, the probability of being able to identify it and solve it goes up exponentially. And then finally, on that front, I would say that remembering the rebalancing of the power dynamics was at the core of treaties. If you're engaging on the same basis that you're engaging with everybody else, chances are very good you've missed the core point of the treaty. It's not simply another group to be consulted. It is a government that we agreed existed, that we agreed had the authorities that it has, and that has the right to engage with us in a way that is distinct from almost anybody else. We've done some interesting things. We've had the directive that Jim referred to on the federal approach to modern treaty implementation. We've set up the Deputy Minister's Oversight Committee on Implementation. We're doing a review of that. Many of you will be involved in the interviews around that process and offering your thoughts. We have a lot of work to do. But I think I'd come back to this point. I want to have you be clear that we understand, that I understand, that you made a leap of faith 20, 30, 40 years ago in some cases, 40 months ago in some other cases, that was the source of great controversy in the people that you represent. Our job, and we recognize this, is to demonstrate not only to your community but to all Canadians that that was the right choice. Thank you.
We've got 4 minutes for questions. No. Oh, he's going for coffee. He's not answering. Do you guys want to take a question? Yeah? Kirk?
Good morning, and thank you very, very much for those presentations. Very interesting. I've been working off and on with Land Claims Agreements Coalition for some time now, and Daniel, one of the things that was put before the government a few years ago is the notion of a modern treaty implementation review commission. Now, your comment about standardization, interesting to hear that comment, because what appears to have happened in the last, or through the last election and now with the new mandate letter to the minister, is that that concept has been embraced or perhaps submerged within a broader commissioner that's expressed in that letter. And I'm just wondering if the concept of the Modern Treaty Implementation Review Commission is completely off the table, or is that still something that can be part of the dialogue going forward? Thank you.
Thanks for the question, a great one. Number one, I think it'll be part of the dialogue, because I can't imagine for the life of me when we have that conversation that you're not going to stand up and say exactly that thing collectively. Jim is quite right to point out the legislation that came into effect. I didn't mention it in my remarks, but that is actually a quantum shift. I mean, it is the mirror image opposite of what we were doing in the 1970s and 80s, when we had contractors negotiating agreements on our behalf but had no departmental link to it, and certainly no ministerial link in that way. And so to now have it written into the legislation that is not only an authority but a responsibility is in itself an important thing. So I'm confident that that will be part of the conversation, yes.
Okay. Do you have any final comments?
No, just on that point that Kirk raised and Daniel's addressed, the conversation is ongoing. What we see in the mandate letter in particular, and it's just the most recent example of this, is it appears to those of us who are not on the inside of the relationship between the centre and Indigenous peoples that much of this is driven, well, put it like this, the distinctions-based approach seems to be shorthand for we only deal with the national organizations. And that's a real problem, because the national organizations cannot stand as intermediaries between the real nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship between modern treaty holders and the Crown. It's not a nation-to-national, organization-to-nation relationship. It's a nation-to-nation relationship. And so we see that in the reference in the mandate letter, not to a Modern Treaty Implementation Review Commission, which I'm sure coalition members will continue to press for, but rather to a, I forget what it's called, National Treaty Commissioner, an all-stop, all-purpose Aboriginal Indigenous Complaints Department or something. But that's not the MTIRC, and it continues to be part of the agenda. But I think that's part I didn't get to, is the relationship seems to be forced into being mediated with national organizations, and that's for all the reasons I said, Daniel said, and every signatory knows, that's just wrong.
Thank you for that comment, because I think that doesn't get addressed enough. Thank you. Could you please help me in thanking these gentlemen for their time this morning? And if I can have Lena Ivik and Jordan Peterson make their way up. I didn't see Lena. There she is. Thank you, guys. Okay, you have to stay. I love it. So our next panel is For a Better Tomorrow, titled For a Better Tomorrow. And we have Lena Ivik. Lena is a powerhouse woman who's involved in so many things in her community. It's amazing. And Jordan Peterson, where did you go? I saw you earlier. Come on up. They're going to be speaking on the topic of ways to support community well-being for a better tomorrow. Lena Ivik is the president of Peruvic Center, Inc. in Iqaluit. Yes. And Jordan Peterson is the deputy grand chief, vice president of the Quijin Tribal Council. Thank you. Do you want to go first? You can. You have a PowerPoint. It doesn't matter. Okay. And Lena, your PowerPoint is here. You don't. Okay. No, you good. Okay. They're trying to decide who's going first. Ladies first.
Yeah. First, I have to dress myself.
And Marielle is here in the front, and she's on transfer. She'll let you know when you have 3 minutes left. Okay. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Lena Ivik and Jordan Peterson. Thank you.
Kauna marimilyung ulakut, tamasi tapanikusi, inokatika. Good morning to each and every one of you here today, and thank you to the organizers, the magic makers behind the scene, and thank you to the leaders. Inokatika tapanikusi, kiviangavilusi sivulokpaming. Uvagut ukausingagut nilligalago mayunga. Takwa piloaktuming sivuluktigisimayavun ullumimun ubunga tikititisimayun imailurnitinik akunealuk pilerilauktu piloaktuming nunavut kanuiktuulaangmangaq takunnagaulluni takwa quyannamirtakka Jamie Sikkut John Amarualikku tapanittukulumata. Amma uvagut kinguvangu yugut, ilissi kinguvangu yusi. Taimaak takunnaga qarassi sivunirmut nalunangimmat. Taimaattauk kayusineaqqugun. Teikunga aqaagunut aggirtunun. Nakungmik umayakkataakwa sivullerpaami. So I'm back here after 2 years on the same stage. 2 years ago, at the last gathering of the National Land Claims Coalition Conference, as part of my opening comments, I talked about coming across an article a few years earlier that was so timely to the events we were discussing. But after checking the date on the article, I saw, in fact, that it had been written almost 30 years earlier. That article was about our Inuit leaders who had gathered in Rankin Inlet 5 years before the signing of the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement. Inuit leaders urged the Canadian government of the day to recognize Inuktitut as an official language of Canada through a provision in the land claim. As we all know, there is no such article in our living Nunavut land claim. Therefore, we are still today on the first verse of the same song. This morning, am I just going to add on more wording to the same verse? This was my question coming here. Kullik is an Inuit oil lamp. As you may know, is one of the many traditional, original, authentic innovations of my people, Inuit of the Arctic. Besides our transportation technology, which was the dog team, Kullik was our technology to thrive in our environment. Our own expert scientific-based technological equipment built with everything from our Arctic world was a demonstration of our self-reliance, self-sufficiency, which almost disappeared from our lives as we transitioned from our traditional culture to our relocated communities. Having traveled that difficult journey with us, the Kullik has become a powerful symbol that, of our resilience as a people of the Arctic. Today, as we think about what is happening right now across Canada in terms of outcry of Indigenous people, I ask myself, how much more are we going to lose? I've been invited to speak to you today on the topic of sustaining Indigenous languages. The title of this plenary is For a Better Tomorrow, which extends to ways to support well-being in our modern treaty context. 2 years ago, I also echoed something along the lines of, in our traditional life, Inuit often spend time at a place called Aulnervik. This was a temporary place, a transitioning camp, where a family or hunters would stay while they waited for the trail to become passable for the upcoming season. A stay at Aulnervik would often involve proper gear preparation for the trip. For example, fine-tuning tools and gear, waiting for the trail to be safe, hunting along the shoreline, and fundamentally shifting the ease of mind from winter hibernation inside dwellings to the outdoors once again. I also said at the same time that I believe that we, as Indigenous cultures, are in our Aulnervik era. A temporary stop as we search for our permanent place of resilience, freedom, and self-determination. We have begun to delve deep into our inner world of collective voice as we gather our strength and gear for the great change. Well, today, I've come to conclude as the vision keeper of Pirolvik Center that this Aulnervik era I referred to 2 years ago is now embodied by a tangible, real group of young Inuit who have endured years of hunger to learn their own language and are now full-time students of our Aulnervik Inuktitut language program for Inuktitut second language learners. Just like the Aulnervik I described, they are only in a temporary phase, prepping their gear to master skills and knowledge required to advance to our Qimatuvik, Inuktitut first language program for Inuit. 2 years ago, I was also able to share with you Pirolvik's aspirations of the potential of full-time Inuktitut programming that could only happen with adequate funding and commitment from funders. After all, we were only running ad hoc, short-term language programs for 15 years, knowing full well